Geek Therapy Radio.
Welcome to Geek Therapy Radio podcast. I am, of course, your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. Very happy to have you here today and every day as I record these podcasts 5 days a week. Just a reminder that the show tomorrow, the big podcast, the broadcast as I call it, and that's what it is as well, is awesome. It's huge and it's awesome. 4 guests on the show: George Norrie from Coast to Coast AM, Clint from Lazy Game Reviews, Colin from This Does Not Compute, and David, the 8-Bit Guy from The 8-Bit Guy on YouTube. 4 guests were reminiscing about fond memories regarding old technology that some of us thought was cool, but that wound up didn't making it. Sometimes it was old technology that we thought was cool at the time, and we bought it, and then it wound up not being as useful as we thought. So it's a fun show that drops tomorrow, and the broadcast of it all occurs Saturday night here in Houston, of course. Quick reminder about the Patreon. I started the Patreon, and I told you that I would only remind you of it in the podcasts, not in the actual broadcasts. So I'm reminding you of that. It's completely voluntary, but I'll tell you right off the bat that 5% of my pledges each month goes to help those with mental illness. So any of your help is greatly appreciated, completely voluntary. You don't have to. So there's different tiers of the Patreon, of course. I just bumped into my desk. And the first tier starts off at $2. It's just $2 a month, and what you get, a perk with that. I mean, there's tons of the perks. Regardless, I will be putting up unedited interviews up on the Patreon, occasionally giving stuff away, but there's some guaranteed perks, and that is anybody who pledges on Patreon gets a shout out at least once in the podcast. So I've got a couple of shout outs to make. Asaf, thank you very much for your pledge, and Jamie, very, very much appreciated. You know what? I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, I'm not saying last names, because I don't want to assume that anybody wants their last name given, but if you heard your name mentioned here in the podcast and you don't have a problem with mentioning your last name, just let me know. But Asaf and Jamie, thank you very much for your donation. I've talked to Asaf many times through email. Well, not many times, several times. Just a wonderful, wonderful fellow out there in Israel. I am so happy to have your support, and Jamie, you as well. Thank you so much. All right, so let's move on with some topics du jour today of the podcast. It's kind of funny. I should mention this first before we get into frame rates and movies and TVs and stuff like that. I just got done watching the last episode of season 3 or season 4 of Downton Abbey. It's not a show I ever thought I would watch in my entire life, but the movie is coming out soon, and I knew my wife likes it. I know my sister-in-law likes it. At least those two like it, and I knew that, okay, that movie's probably going to happen in my future. I'm probably going to see Downton Abbey. I'll give one episode a shot. It's a really freaking good show. Downton Abbey is a wonderful, wonderful show, and I think I've pinpointed why I like it so much. My wife might like it so much because it's British. She likes to fall asleep to David Attenborough commenting on, I don't know, penguin poop or something. So the British accent, drinking tea sometimes when we watch, but I figured it out for me. I like anything that's done, I like period films and period pieces. So at one time I liked Mad Men. I don't like Mad Men anymore, but I liked kind of those shows that take place during a very specific era. And Downton Abbey takes place pre and post World War I. So it starts in the late 1900s, so 19 teens, since it's before World War I, and it goes into the 1920s at least. So I really like all the sets, and I like that it's placed in old times. I like the old cars. I really like those dedicated era pieces, those period pieces. So I like Downton Abbey, and my only comment on that was, I'm not going to give any spoilers, but it's not a stretch to say that in the show, people die. That happens in every single show. And I told my wife, I was like, why can't there be a show where people just don't die? Why does somebody key always have to die in these things? She said, well, they'd have to keep paying the actors. Oh, I guess that's a pragmatic view of it. No, so Downton Abbey, it's I don't want to say it's a difficult show to watch, but it's one of those shows that'll suck you in and then basically kill your favorite people. It's one of those things that I don't get it. Why can't they just make a show where people you like stay alive? Should I watch Game of Thrones? I haven't seen any Game of Thrones yet, and I know that's going to shock you. Apparently there's people in there that get killed off who you don't expect to or want to see get killed off. Breaking Bad was the same. All of these shows are like that now. I guess it's nothing new. They've always been like that. So anyways, I'll get off that little rant and diatribe. I will say also briefly that I just wrote up the script to a YouTube video that I'm going to make showcasing my Tascam 688. It's an 8-track cassette recorder. You remember 4-track cassette recorders that record 4 instruments down onto one tape, 4 tracks down on one tape, so you can record vocals and guitars and drums and such onto one tape. The Tascam 688 doubles the amount of channels available, so you have 8 channels to record all the more sources to the tape. It's a very fascinating machine. I joke to my wife that is one of the only things that material objects that I would save in a house fire. And I say that facetiously, but it also kind of depends where the fire starts. I think it's kind of a heavy piece, but I love it. I refurbished it. I put a new belt on it a few years ago. It runs and works beautifully and sounds awesome. And it's just a very interesting piece of vintage recording technology. It's from the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. So it is the greatest that cassette recording has ever been, right before the dawn of digital. So it has a very interesting history. It's a very interesting piece. I've just written the script to that. So look forward to that. Subscribe on YouTube if you haven't already. All right, so it's kind of funny. On to the topic du jour. It's kind of funny that earlier today, every once in a while, my friend Jeremy, also a coworker, friend first, coworker second, he'll come into the studio where I work every day at KTRH, and just to look out the window, look at the traffic on 610, and it's because his studio that he works in doesn't have any windows. It's kind of a cave, and a man needs light. He needs sunlight, so he comes to my studio, which is surrounded on 2 sides by windows. It's actually a view and a location in a studio that I take for granted, because most all of the other studios are shut in. There's no windows. But KTRH does have an expansive view of the area, and I take it for granted sometimes. So anyway, sometimes Jeremy comes in there. He doesn't come in every day because of what winds up happening every time he walks in, is we get to gabbing, sometimes for an hour or two. Hopefully no bosses are listening, but they understand. We're getting our work done, but we'll keep going back and forth, keep coming back, and we'll just be talking at length. And sometimes I've had him on the show. I say, all right, hold that thought, Jeremy. Let me just hit the record button. I can get a lot of material for the show off this, and we just wind up gabbing about graphics cards and RTX and ray tracing and audio and mixing and mastering and all sorts of stuff. So today I was telling him about the miracle that is the 75-inch TV that I'm looking at right now and use as a computer monitor. I game with it, of course, also. But yeah, it's my main computer monitor, and how it was submerged on one side under 6 to 7 inches of water. I've told you, the listeners, about that in the past. The water splotches have gone. They are non-existent. It has made a miraculous recovery. Most people, I feel, would have seen those splotches and just thought the TV is totaled. They would never be able to unsee the splotches. The splotches would never go away. The water damage is too severe. And I thought, you know what? It's a free TV. This is a TV that my dad had before he died. I'd really like to hang on to it if possible. So I took the TV apart. I took the back of it off. I had a box fan running on it for 2 or 3 days. And that's when I noticed the splotches reducing. The water had gotten in between the layers of the screen. It wasn't a surface stain of water. It was actual water that was in between the panels of the LCD screen, or the LED, whatever the technology of this TV is. It was in the display, and I thought, how would the water even evaporate if it could? It's stuck between layers of plastic and glass. There's no way. But I had the box fan running on it for a couple days. I noticed the splotches reducing, and I thought it might just be in my mind, but each day I would mark it, I'd take pictures. They are slowly but surely going away, and even still I thought there's no way they're going to go away completely. Sure enough, last night I was looking at the screen, and this is what I told Jeremy, and this is what got us on the discussion of frame rates and movies and all sorts of things, is I said, you know what, I didn't realize it until last night. Those splotches are gone off of the TV. It's completely cured, as if it had never touched water, as if it had never flooded. So that is a straight up technological miracle. And I'm so glad I didn't give up on this TV, because it wound up being an awesome gaming TV. When I first gave this TV a try several years ago, it was terrible for gaming because I thought it didn't have a game mode. I couldn't find it in the TV's display settings, but it wound up, the game mode was in some other more obscure option menu, settings menu. So it did have a game mode. I turned on game mode and turned off every little effect of the TV. So digital noise reduction that is on the screen, so it makes gradient colors, like something that goes from gray to black can look kind of digital and blocky. That function, the noise reduction, can kind of make that gradient seem more natural, except it's unnatural. All of these special effects that they put on these TVs as options, just in my opinion, makes the picture look worse. So you put game mode on, and that eliminates a lot of that background processing, and then you go through and you turn off every single other background process or image enhancement in the TV itself. And now the latency on the TV is sub 10 milliseconds. I believe it's at about 6 milliseconds, I read online. It is a wonderful, remember, 75-inch TV here. It is a baller status gaming TV, absolutely baller status. There are computer monitors that would struggle to get down to 6 milliseconds. That's not so true now today, when you can buy monitors at 240 hertz with sub 1 millisecond latency in refresh rates, but 6 milliseconds, that's one frame of 60 seconds, or of 60 frames a second. If I'm doing the math right, I believe 6 milliseconds is one frame. That's perfectly adequate for gaming. That is better than I'm used to for gaming, quite frankly. The only thing better than that in my personal use in my home is the CRT monitor that's right below my 75-inch screen. I've got an old 20-inch or 19-inch CRT tube TV that I have. I plug in vintage video games and vintage computers into for the full authentic experience. So, great TV. Jeremy asked, what does game mode basically do? And I said it turns off all of those features and functions, especially the bane of my existence, my most hated feature on TVs of all, and I'm sure a lot of you listening would agree with this. It goes by a lot of different names under different manufacturers. You'll see the TV advertised as 120 hertz refresh rate with True Motion or Smooth Sync or whatever they call it. It's fake processing. It is artificial bump of the frame rate to take something that is, let's say, a movie at 24 frames a second and attempt to bump it up to 120 frames a second. And the result, some people call it the soap opera effect. It looks terrible. It looks way too smooth. It takes you out of it. It does not look natural, especially when you're watching Lord of the Rings or something like that. That's supposed to be cinematic, 24 frames a second. 24 frames a second is perfect for movies. It's terrible for gaming, of course. But for movies, 24 frames a second, that's part of the feel of the movie. So trying to bump up frame rates beyond 24 frames a second for a cinematic feature winds up putting a lot of people off. It doesn't feel right. It's almost like we want high refresh rates, of course, when we game, but then when we go to movies, if it's anything above 24 frames a second, a lot of people it takes them out of it. That's not what they expect from a movie. And perhaps that is psycho-visual or something like that. Maybe it's all in our minds that it's because we've been conditioned to that frame rate over the decades, that's what we expect a movie to see, and if a movie deviates from that refresh rate, then it's not really a movie to us. It takes us out of it, so to speak. And I'm bringing all that up because it's funny sort of how the world works. Jeremy and I were talking about this smooth motion stuff and all these different gimmicks TV manufacturers put in their TVs that it's such a pain in the butt to go through and turn all of those features off so you can just have a normal freaking image on your screen without all the fake smoothing and everything. We were talking about that at length, and then I go on the internet shortly before recording this podcast here, and I see that new Will Smith movie, Gemini Man, is getting absolutely destroyed by the critics. Absolutely just emaciated is not the right word at all, even though young Will Smith kind of looks emaciated, very thin. Just devastated. Critics are just absolutely pummeling this movie. And it's funny. I'm reading this article on New Atlas, and a lot of people, as it turns out, one of the big experiments of Gemini Man wasn't just this deep fake type of facial CGI technology they used in the game or in the movie. That's not even part of it. That part is kind of neat. That's kind of cool. It's neat to see an artificial young Will Smith, but looks so real and lifelike. But this is Ang Lee's continuing commitment to high frame rate movies. So Gemini Man was shot in 4K digital 3D at 120 frames per second. Now, those specs for a video game are amazing. That would be wonderful to get a solid 120 frames per second on any video game you play in 4K or 3D 4K. Those would be wonderful specs in a video game. But audiences hate it. So many people are ripping this movie apart because of that high frame rate, because it is not the 24 frames per second that they are used to. And that brought up this whole argument in my mind, and that's why I'm doing the podcast on this subject. It popped in my head earlier today. Later today, I find out that it's actually a big deal for moviegoers in Hollywood, this upping the frame rates. High frame rates are also good in sporting events. If football or baseball or hockey, whatever, would broadcast at a true 120 frames per second, that would be wonderful for sports, where it's quick action and you don't want motion blur. You just want everything to be crisp and sharp and follow the puck, especially in hockey. Follow the baseball, follow the football, whatever. 120 frames a second, wonderful. When you go into a movie, are you off-put when it's more than 24 frames a second? Wasn't the latest Transformers at 60 frames a second? It looked weird to me. I don't like it. It's not even a novelty for me. When I go to the movies, I don't want that high refresh rate. I want it 24 frames a second. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier. Is that just some sort of psycho-visual thing with us? Do we most of us prefer 24 frames a second in a cinematic experience simply because we were accustomed to it and raised with it for decades? And that's my question to you. Does it bother you to see high frame rate movies, or to see that smoothing effect applied to 24 frames a second movies to make them artificially 120 frames a second? Does that bother you? Because there are people, and granted, these are people that aren't so, how do I put this? They don't care about the technical aspect of things. Maybe they aren't such geeks about frame rates and sample rates and and how movies are made and the behind the scenes stuff and how fast the film moves across the lens. By the way, 24 frames a second, the reason why it settled on 24 frames a second is because film was expensive, and running at any higher speed increased the cost to the studio. So they settled on 24 frames a second because anything below that starts to become discernible by the human eye as perceived as stuttering and inconsistent. So 24 frames a second was settled on because anything higher was too expensive and anything lower looked stuttery to the human eye. So anyways, back to what I was saying. There are people who don't care about frame rates. I'll bring this up because it's pertinent to the story. I remember vividly in a different life, my ex-mother-in-law, we were watching a movie, and I said, I can't watch this anymore, in their living room, and I said, I'm going to go outside. I can't watch this anymore. That little smoothing effect is wrecking my eyes. I can't watch this. It's terrible. And everybody in the room didn't know what I was talking about. They're like, that's just what this looks like. That's just what the show looks like. It's like, no. This show is, I didn't go into too much detail, but I was just saying that the show was shot at 24 frames a second or 30 frames a second. This is artificial. All these effects are artificial. It's adding artifacts in between some frames. It's too smooth. It has a soap opera effect. It makes everything look cheap. It takes me out of the experience. And I know maybe I'm the only one who cares about that, but it actually is affecting my ability to enjoy this. And it's one of those things where once you mentioned it, it couldn't be unseen by anybody else in the room. So now they all noticed it. And I felt bad for saying it. I said, I didn't mean to bring it to your attention to ruin anything for you, but they all realized, oh yeah, I don't remember things looking like that. I just thought it was just part of the way new TVs were. I thought it was just a part of the way new broadcasts were. I said, I'm so sorry for ruining your day. But I can change it. I can fix the TV. I can turn all that crap off. And yes, please do. Her dad insisted that I take off that, well, he cussed, but take off that BS filters on the TV and fix it. So there are people who just either don't notice it or it doesn't affect them enough for them to care. But it affects me enough to care. And that's my question to you. Does it affect you enough to care? Are you happy seeing movies at over 24 frames a second? Are you happy to see movies at 60 frames per second, 120 frames per second, and beyond? If and when we get to the point, in the foreseeable future where we're at 8K, 120 frames per second, I think what it boils down to, really, a big part of this is that the movie itself has to be good first. I think a lot of technological experimentation can be forgiven if the movie itself is good. I have not seen Gemini Man myself. It is not something that I was interested in seeing, but now that it's getting so destroyed by critics, and I know it's at 120 frames per second, I think I might see it just to see what all the fuss is about. But I can't imagine I will like it. But that being said, if the story's good, if it's a good movie underneath all the technological jargon, then I think that's one thing. I think that would make up for the technological experimentation. It's kind of like old video games, and this is what I'll wrap it up on. I'm 20-something minutes into it right now. This is what I'll wrap things up with. There are old video games for the Atari that are better and more fun and more engaging than new games that have come out just today or that will come out tomorrow. Graphics alone and visual eye candy alone does not make a game great in itself. Eye candy makes great games better, but great games are great games no matter if it's at 200 pixels by 160 pixels or 2,860 pixels by 4,360 pixels or what have you. Ray tracing, all this kind of stuff. If the game sucks at its core, if it's not a good story, if it doesn't have good mechanics, if the gameplay is terrible, if the controls are terrible, if it doesn't suck you in, if it's not engaging, it doesn't matter how good it looks. That's a lesson Hollywood is learning, apparently, with Gemini Man. And again, I can't comment on it because I have not seen it, but critics are destroying it because they don't think it's a good movie to begin with. But I can understand that sentiment, having grown up a gamer and thinking fondly of old games. One of my favorite games of all time, bar none on any system ever, and I've mentioned this before, is Donkey Kong on the Game Boy. Is the precursor to Mario versus Donkey Kong. But on the Game Boy in 1994, it was just called Donkey Kong. It is a wonderful, fun game. Link's Awakening on the original Game Boy, not even Game Boy Color, not even Link's Awakening DX, but Link's Awakening on the regular Game Boy. Playing that on a Game Boy Pocket, just grayscale and pixely, it's a gorgeous game. It's beautiful. They did so much with the available pixels, and the game itself has heart and character for days and eons. At its core, it's a great game, and we didn't need all the graphics, and we didn't need all the super high refresh rate. The engineers and programmers and creators and designers just made a great game to begin with. So if we are going to get into a future where 120 frames per second movies are just mainstream, that can't be the selling point. What draws us into the theater always has to be a solid story or something that looks fascinating and interesting, enough to get us into the theaters. And that's my only piece on that. What do you think, though? Email me, geektherapy@iheartmedia.com, geektherapy@iheartmedia.com. I really want to know what you think about high refresh rate movies. I know we all like high refresh rate video games, but what do you think about high refresh rate cinema? Does anything over 24 frames a second take you out of it? Or do you welcome 60 frames a second, 90, 120, 240 frames a second, so long as the story's good? Or is it all schlock? I don't care how good the story is, give me what I'm used to, 24 frames a second. geektherapy@iheartmedia.com. Let me know. Also, Geek Therapy Radio on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, all that good stuff. geektherapyradio.com for more. Plug the Patreon one more time. Just go on Patreon and look for Geek Therapy Radio. If you want to, it is up to you. Other than that, you know what I'm going to tell you. Each and every podcast, be good to yourselves and others. Embrace your inner geek and know that you are worthy of love. Until tomorrow, take care.
Geek Therapy Radio, Saturday night at 10 on KPRC 950. Or listen anytime on our iHeartRadio app.